Russia can't even beat Ukraine. So how can they fight NATO? They would be flattened. This is a pro-Western narrative that I hear a lot, obviously, because I live here in the West. Let me tell you why this is actually a pro-Western talking point at best and a blatant Western propaganda tool at worst that doesn't give you the full picture. So, first off, Ukraine is losing the war. That's the fact that you will not hear in Western legacy media, especially. Its economy has been hit hard. Hear me out, by the way, because you might already disagree. But hear me out. Its economy has been hit hard because that's what happens to a country that's being invaded. Its population is suffering dramatically too, with potentially hundreds of thousands of fighting age men now having been killed in the conflict in the far east of the country. So there's a lack of fighting men, which means there's a lack of working men, right? Bad for the economy. It's so bad. President Zelensky of Ukraine offered prisoners in Ukraine with combat experience an end to their sentence if they agreed to join the fight against Russia. The lack of trained men, if any men can be found at all in fact, is causing a lot of strain on Ukrainian military commanders as well. Okay, and it takes a lot, by the way, for military commanders to turn and criticize their own troops, right? But, quote, hear this out. Ukrainian military commanders, quote, blamed recent Russian advances, recent as in just a couple of months ago, in Donetsk as being the fault of newly mobilized Ukrainian soldiers. They blamed the conscripts for having poor training, retreating too easy, not shooting at the enemy, oh god, and simply walking away from battle. Can you imagine, guys? So Ukraine is struggling, right? And you have to keep in mind, conscripts that are not trained are still people, right? This is obvious, but I'm just pointing out the obvious because sometimes we gloss over it. They're still people. So on the front line, if they face off against battle-hardened professional Russian soldiers and Russian soldiers kill them, you're still dying, right? That's still a family that's lost their breadwinner. That's still an economy that's lost a hard-working man for the rest of his life, okay? He's just gone, even though he was poorly trained. Because this poorly trained doesn't mean it's any less of a loss to the state. Whereas on the Russian side, they're just taking fewer losses because their people are better trained. Their soldiers are now better trained than the Ukrainians, who can barely put a couple of working age or fighting age men together. Anyway, Russia can't even beat Ukraine. That's the main point we're talking about. So let's go back to that. Do you know how much financial support Ukraine has received in this some 2.5 years? You won't believe this. 210 billion US dollars over the course of these 2.5 years. Just to put that into perspective for you, the GDP of Ukraine, of the whole state, is 180 billion US dollars. So they've received more aid from NATO in money and military support than their whole country generates. The whole economy of Ukraine in a whole year makes 180 GDP, and NATO has given them 220 and has promised even more moving forward. That's, all the money from every Ukrainian business, every Ukrainian worker, all the taxpayers, everything of a whole country's economy. And NATO's given them more than that. Do you know how colossal that is? That it's a level of support unprecedented, unheard of. And all of it for a non-NATO country. Keep that in mind. As for weapons, well, listen to this. NATO member countries are sending weapons, ammunition, and many types of light and heavy military equipment to Ukraine, including anti-tank and air defense systems, howitzers, drones, tanks, and fighter jets. NATO's Article 5 security guarantee and its ironclad promise of collective defense, we've talked about this in a previous TikTok, provides allies with the confidence that they can send weapons to Ukraine without diminishing their own security. Do you know where I read that from? That's from the NATO website. It was posted on the 3rd of October, literally last month. The title of the article, quote, NATO's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, end quote. So you see, in many ways, Russia, guys, is already fighting NATO. It's just that NATO has used Ukraine as the battlefield so that they don't have to lose men, NATO men. They don't have to fight on the soil of NATO member countries. They've used Ukraine as the punching bag. Why get punched after all when you can pay someone to get punched on your behalf? It's safer that way after all. They will be your champion, right? And we see that, by the way. Ukraine is in the UK, for example, Ukraine is considered the champion of the West in this fight. Their soldiers are glorified. Their cause is a noble one. They're defending democracy and their homeland and this and that. And like all good lies, there is some truth sprinkled in to boost believability. Now, the situation in Ukraine is going in Russia's favor. Another fact. Look up any map of Ukraine and you will see 5 oblasts. Oblasts are the Russian or Ukrainian name for states. You will see 5 oblasts that have been in Russian control or partial control for the last 2 years. A losing army, a losing state doesn't hold land in the other state. Crimea, fully controlled. Luhansk, fully controlled. Kherson, partially controlled. Zaporizhia, partially controlled. Donetsk, partially controlled. And it's not that Russia isn't struggling. It's not that Russia is struggling to hold these. They haven't lost them. They haven't been retaken by Ukraine at all in the last couple of years of fighting. Now, Russia has switched to a attritional warfare stance. Let me explain what that means for people. Low casualties, low resource usage, low equipment wastage, slow advancement. This is a war stance you take if you're a state to conserve manpower and resources while making slow and steady advance. And it's often used against an enemy that is expected to buckle under the weight of your pressure and under their own attrition and losses already sustained. And Russia feels that Ukraine is in this position. And all of this before Trump comes into office and drags everyone and all the American money straight out of Eastern Europe. What are you going to do then? Right? So in summary, Russia is not struggling against Ukraine. Russia is fighting a heavily backed and funded and supported by Ukraine, by NATO, Ukraine. Russia is fighting a NATO-supported Ukraine. A Ukraine who has been given NATO equipment and NATO training and NATO tactics guidance and has been using NATO weaponry of the most sophisticated and advanced, especially recently green-lighted missile technology from France and the UK and the US. A Ukraine that has had more than its entire GDP donated to it by NATO countries. And NATO countries are committing even more financial support in the years to come. Some have committed financial support indefinitely. And even after all of that, Russia is still not losing. They're holding back their punches and still they're advancing. They are conserving their energy. For what? Perhaps, well, after this is done, Putin will look north to the Baltic states and attempt to join Kaliningrad to the mainland of Russia and Belarus. A bit of a wild analysis there to be dished out on TikTok, but that we'll save for another one. Thanks for listening to this very long analysis piece. See you on the next one.